get down to business. Thanks for coming out tonight.
I wrote me a manual, a step-by-step booklet for you to get.
Oh, I make money moves.
You can't see me, my time is now.
What up, guys? Welcome back to the Fitness Times Business Podcast. My name is Joseph Mencel. I am your host. Guys, I'm riding solo in this episode, and I have inside one of the most important messages that I have dropped in a solo episode of this show, probably this year, to be thinking back on it. Definitely one of the most important, if not the most important. So I know you guys are going to take so much value and so much practical advice from this episode. But before I get stuck in, I just want to express a little bit of gratitude, and I just want to express some thanks. At the time of shooting this episode, it's actually Thanksgiving in the US, something that we don't celebrate here in Australia, but we, in my personal opinion, I think we definitely should. To be honest, in my personal opinion, Thanksgiving is something that we should be celebrating each and every day. Personally, it's something that I do in my gratitude journaling each and every morning. And I just want to, this year has been such an extraordinary year. It's been such a crazy year, jam-packed with challenges and just a whole bunch of shit that so many of us could not have anticipated, not only dealing with, but actually getting through. And one of the shining lights this year, especially for me personally, has been the success of this podcast, the success of this show. And I attribute so much of that to you guys, because you really are the vehicle that has allowed this show to reach so many people. And I personally believe that the messages that we're articulating in this podcast, the practical advice that we're giving in this podcast, the experience that we're sharing in this podcast is so fucking valuable when it's in the hands of people who can use it. And you guys have been the vehicle to get the messages that we share in this show in the hands of people who can use it. So I just want to start off by saying just a massive, heartfelt thank you to each and every one of you guys who not only tunes into every episode of the Fitness Times Business Podcast, but to each and every one of you guys who takes the time to share it. Whether you're sharing it in your Instagram story and tagging me in there, whether you're sharing it, we've got a bunch of social events coming up as we head into holiday season, whether you're sharing it person to person, when the conversation comes up about different content you've been consuming, shows you're watching on YouTube, shows you're watching on Netflix, podcasts you're listening to, and you just drop in there, the Fitness Times Business Podcast. Man, I am so fucking grateful for you guys. And I just want to open this episode up. It's timely because it is Thanksgiving. So I just want to give thanks to each and every one of you guys who tunes into the show and takes the time to share it, because the more of you who share it, the more people who we can get this show to in the hands who can use the information that we articulate in each and every episode. So thank you guys. Back to Basics is the title of this show. I'm going to talk to you guys about why executing the basics perfectly and consistently is so important. And this is such an important message, guys. I've done a few episodes of this podcast and its predecessor, The Massive Joe Show, on topics such as simple but not easy, on topics such as, getting the fundamentals right. That was not actually the title. I can't remember what the title was, but it was on the fundamentals. This episode is very specific to why executing the basic fundamentals, not only once, not only twice, but continuously, is so crucially important to achieving success in whatever area of your life you're trying to achieve success in. And just a little bit of background for you guys. I actually wasn't going to record this episode today. I had a different episode planned, but this has happened a bunch of times to me. Sometimes there's too many things that happen for it to be a coincidence. And this week, in fact, not just this week, over the last couple of days, there's been a couple of things that happened. I had to have a chat to a couple of my team members in the Massive Joe's business because they were just dropping the ball on some real basic fundamental bits and pieces that just need to get done perfectly and need to get done consistently, time and time again, to allow them to perform to the best of their abilities in this business. And then literally this morning, I had a conversation with my partner, Amy, while we were in the gym training, and we were just looking at a few people training and just noticing their form and the exercises that they were doing, and just the complete disregard for the basics when it comes to training. And we started talking about it, and I was like, nah, there's too many things happening in the last couple of days. I need to drop some content on why executing the basics perfectly and consistently is so important. So the way I want to do this, guys, I want to talk about 4 different areas. Obviously, the content of this episode you can apply to any area of your life, but I'm going to drill down into 4 specific areas. I'm going to talk about dieting. I'm going to talk about training. I'm going to talk about business, and then I'm going to talk about career. So I want to start with, there's basic fundamentals in everything that we do. Every single thing we do, there are basics that need to be done that set up the foundation for us to build upon. And when we look at dieting, training, business, career, I'm going to go through them one by one and just point out, in my personal opinion, and this is just my personal opinion, this is just picking a few examples that come to my mind when I think about them. But when we look at dieting, in my opinion, the basic fundamentals are hitting your caloric and macronutrient intake depending on your goals. If you're trying to build muscle, you have to be in a caloric surplus, and you have to be at an approximately 40-40-20 carb, protein, fat macro split to give your body the building blocks to build muscle. If you're trying to lose body fat, you got to be in a caloric deficit. And if you're trying to lose body fat and maintain muscle, the macronutrient split's going to be about the same. 40-40-20 carbs, proteins, fats. When we talk about training, your basic fundamentals are, of course, proper form, progressive overload, and then I threw prehab in there as well, because we're trying to mitigate injuries when it comes to training so that we can be as consistent as we can be with our training as possible. When you look at business, your basic fundamentals are maintaining your margins, ensuring your business is profitable, and being on top of your business cash flow. Cash flow is king in any business. You got to be on top of it. Those are your basics. Those are your fundamentals. When we look at career, if you're not a business owner, but you're an employee, very simple. Your basics, your fundamentals, the things you need to execute perfectly and consistently time after time are your key performance indicators, your KPIs. You got to do them. I think that so many of us understand what the basics are, right? You probably resonated with a bunch of things I said in dieting, training, business, career just then. You get it, right? We understand what the basics are. We know what the fundamentals are. We know what we need to execute perfectly and consistently to build that base are. We get it. But I think that we often find ourselves, and I don't just think, I see this time and time again. Like I said to you guys, I had to have a couple of chats to a couple of different team members this week that just forgot to execute, to be completely honest, just forget to execute the basics perfectly and consistently. And in the gym this morning, I see it every fucking morning that I'm training in the gym. Every time I'm in the gym, I see people just fail to execute the basics perfectly and consistently. And I think that what happens is we tend to get carried away with the fluff, with the fancy, with the shiny, with the new exciting stuff. Or I'm going to use an analogy that's kind of timely at the moment because we head into holiday season. We get carried away with the decorations on the Christmas tree instead of actually worrying about the Christmas tree itself. And it's a very easy trap to fall into. And to give you guys some examples, when we look at the dieting example, the basics are hitting your caloric and macronutrient intake for your goals. But so many times we find ourselves get distracted. And it's distraction. We find ourselves get distracted with the new dieting method. Maybe it's keto. Maybe it's going vegan or plant-based. Maybe it's carb cycling. And we spend so much time and effort and attention on this distraction, on this shiny thing, on the decorations on our Christmas tree, that we forget to be in caloric surplus if we're trying to build muscle. We forget to be in caloric deficit if we're trying to lose body fat. We forget to hit our macros because now all of a sudden we're distracted by following the keto diet or being plant-based or following the carb cycling. When it comes to training, fellas, you're going to resonate with me, and I've made this, I know personally from personal experience because we've all made this mistake. I have made this mistake many, many times. Is we get too carried away with ego lifting. We're trying to lift too much weight. We're trying to chase certain lifts and our form goes completely out the fucking window. Our progressive overload goes completely out the fucking window. We forget to prehab because that's not important when we're trying to ego lift, right? You don't want to go to the gym, warm up for 20 minutes. You just want to get in and hit your fucking 1 RMs. And the basics go completely out the window because we're distracted by trying to hit certain numbers in the gym. Ladies, this one probably applies more to the ladies than it does the fellas, but I see fellas doing this as well. You get distracted by the fancy exercises that you see your favorite influencer on Instagram doing. The double-banded hip thrusts, for example, the counterbalanced glute pushdowns on the assisted chin-up machine. You get distracted by these fancy exercises that look new and look exciting, and in the meantime, you forget about executing with proper form. You forget about progressive overload. You forget about prehab. You're distracted by the fancy, shiny shit over here. When it comes to business, once again, guys, I have an absolute mountain of personal experiences with mistakes that I've made in business. So I'm speaking from experience here. We get distracted primarily with chasing revenue. We get distracted with growing our top line sales. The old saying, turnover is vanity, profit is sanity. We get distracted by the vanity of turnover. We get distracted by the fancy, nice-looking retail stores. We get distracted by the fancy, nice-looking website or the fancy-looking social media content that we're producing, that we actually lose sight of the basic fundamentals. Are we hitting margins that we need to hit to be profitable? Are our expenses in line with our growth so that we're maintaining profitability? Is our cash flow healthy? What do our cash flow projections look like? And we push all those basic fundamentals to the side. We stop focusing on them because we're distracted by this nice fancy shit. We're distracted by chasing the sales, the top line revenue, the nice fancy new stores, the fancy website, the fancy social media content, and all that shit that we lose sight of executing the basics perfectly and consistently to ensuring that we're maintaining and growing our margin, maintaining and growing our profitability, and maintaining and growing our cash flow. And then finally, when it comes to career, and this is the shit that I had to pull my guys up on this week, too much focus on fancy reporting, too much focus on too many bullshit meetings that don't need to fucking happen. Those meetings that you schedule in for 60 minutes and you fill the 60 minutes with shit, when it didn't even need to be a meeting in the first place. It could have been an email or a message. Or if it was a meeting, it could have been 5 minutes instead of 60. Too much focus on fancy career development courses that distract us from actually hitting our KPIs each and every week. Distract us from executing what we need to execute to ensure that we're hitting our KPIs each and every week. Get distracted by the fanciness, by the fluff. Get distracted by the decorations on that Christmas tree instead of making sure the Christmas tree is legit right from the start. So why are executing the basics perfectly and consistently so important, right? So you guys resonate with me. You know what I'm talking about. You've been in these situations where you've been distracted by this fanciness and you've let the basics slide. But why is it important to stay on top of those basics? There's two main reasons. The first reason is that making sure that you never lose sight of executing the basics perfectly and consistently sets and reinforces the foundation for each and every area of your life. And if you don't set, and importantly, this is not something that you can kind of set and forget, guys. You need to set and reinforce, which is why you need to keep coming back to the basics and executing them perfectly. And keyword here is consistently, time and time again. Because if you don't set and reinforce that foundation, let's go back to the dieting example. The best case scenario is that you make no progress. You jump from keto to plant-based to carb cycling. You've lost sight of the fact that you need to be in caloric surplus or caloric deficit to achieve your goal. The best case scenario is you make no progress. You just run around in fucking circles. The worst case scenario is that you actually start moving backwards, or you pursue a dieting method that actually makes you sick, that actually has even worse negative effects than just moving you backwards. Perhaps keto just does not work for you. And now you got all sorts of hormonal problems that you got to deal with. When we look at training, the best case scenario when you start ego lifting, fellas or ladies, when you start doing all these fancy bullshit exercises that you see Instagram influencers doing, is that you make no progress. Because you've forgotten about proper form, you've forgotten about progressive overload, you've forgotten about your prehab. So you're just going around in circles, making no progress. The worst case scenario is that you move backwards, or worst case scenario is that you get injured. And I've seen this many times. Fellas chasing ego lifts. You're on a bench press, trying to bench press 180, 200, 220 for one rep, whatever the fuck it is, and you rip a pec. Comes straight off the fucking bone. Ladies, you're doing some fancy double-banded hip thrust bullshit without proper form, and you strain a glute, or you strain a quad. Or worse, you tear a glute or you tear a quad and you got to go in for surgery and get that shit reattached. That's worst case scenario if you're not setting and reinforcing the foundation with your basics. When it comes to business, best case scenario, if you lose sight of the basics, is that you don't grow as a business. You kind of stand still, tread in water a little bit, stay in the same place. Worst case scenario, if you lose sight of your margins, your profitability, and your cash flow, your business goes into administration, or your business collapses as the worst case scenario, because you're too focused on all this fancy shit. You're too focused on growing top line revenue, fancy retail stores, fancy website, fancy social media, all the fancy. You lose sight of the basic fundamentals and the whole thing fucking implodes. And I've seen it, guys. I've seen it time and time again. What about career? Best case scenario, if you lose sight of the basic fundamentals, you hit that glass ceiling that I've spoken to you guys about so many times, and you cannot break through that glass ceiling. You're just spinning your wheels. The wheel's spinning, the hamster's dead. Worst case scenario is you lose your job. Worst case scenario, you lose too many jobs in the same career field, your resume looks like shit, end of your career. Go find something else to do. That's the first reason why executing the basics perfectly and consistently is so important. It sets and it reinforces the foundation so that you don't run into these worst case scenarios. The second reason, on a more positive note, is that it allows you to make the most of the fancy. It allows you to make the most of these decorations on your Christmas tree. Because if you're setting and you're reinforcing the basic fundamentals in dieting, if you're in caloric surplus, if you're trying to make gains, if you're in caloric deficit, if you're trying to lose body fat, and you're doing that perfectly and consistently time after time, each and every day, and then you go and throw keto on top of that, you're probably going to accelerate your results. Then you go and throw plant-based dieting on top of that, and that suits you, you're probably going to get better results. Then you go and throw carb cycling on top of a caloric deficit, you're probably going to lose body fat faster. So by focusing and never losing sight of the basic fundamentals, you're actually able to get the most out of the fancy shit that you throw on top. When it comes to your training, if you do have proper form and you are focusing on progressive overload and you are practicing your prehab Adding your heavy lifts on top of it with proper form and progressive overload is going to help you build muscle faster. Adding these fancy exercises that you do see on Instagram with proper form and progressive overload and prehab, you're probably going to be able to hit different parts of different muscles or different muscles altogether that you've never been able to hit. So you're actually going to progress your physique better, faster than you otherwise would. So you're able to make the most of it. In business, if you're on top of your margins and your profitability and your cash flow, and then you go and throw the fancy stores on top, you go and throw the fancy website on top, you go throw the fancy social media on top, and now you start focusing on growing your top line revenue, your business is going to grow. You're going to actually achieve your medium and your long-term business goals, provided you don't lose sight of the basics and you go and throw the fancy stuff on top. What about your career? Provided you are hitting your KPIs, provided you are doing the basics each and every day to make sure that you are hitting your KPIs at the end of every week, hitting your KPIs at the end of every month, then you can go and throw some fancy reporting on top of that. Then you can go and throw some fancy personal career development courses on top of that. You're going to smash through that glass ceiling. Your career is going to go into overdrive. You're going to turbocharge that shit. And you're going to progress along your career faster than you otherwise would. So that's the second reason why executing the basics perfectly and consistently is so important, because you can make the most of everything that you throw on top of them. So let me round this out with some practical advice. I got a 4-step process for you guys. So this is the part that you're probably going to want to listen to a couple of times or take some notes, at least take some mental notes at this point. 4-step process. Step 1, you got to identify what your basics are, right? So I gave you guys my personal input when it comes to dieting, fitness, business, and career. But you have to do that yourself. You got to figure out what are your basics in whatever area of life you're trying to progress in. What are your fundamentals? Be very specific. What actually are they? In your career, is it your KPIs? In your business, is it your margins, your profitability, and your cash flow? My personal opinion, fucking should be. In your training, is it proper form? Is it your prehab? Be very specific with that. That's step number 1. Step number 2, understand what executing the basics perfectly and consistently looks like and feels like. Looks like and feels like. You have to understand, you can't have an idealistic view of what executing the basics look like if it's not realistic. You need to know exactly what hitting your KPIs feels like. You need to know exactly what your profitability as a business looks like. You need to know exactly what cash flow projections feel like. You need to know exactly what proper form feels like. You need to know what being in a caloric deficit feels like. You have to get very granular with understanding what executing your basics looks like and actually feels like, so you know when you are or you are not executing. Step 3 is to actually execute. Guys, I've said this so many times in so many different podcasts and so many different forms of media. Execution is everything. You have to do the fucking work. You got to execute the basics perfectly. You got to execute the basics consistently. And importantly, you have to put some sort of accountability in place to make sure that if you stop executing, you pull yourself up on it. Regular cues have to be in place. Let's look at dieting. Perhaps it's a cue at the end of every day. Did you or did you not hit your caloric intake, your macronutrient intake? Yes or no? When it comes to training, start every exercise with perfect form. That's your cue. Is my form on point? At the end of every exercise, did I progressively overload? At the start of every workout, did I do my prehab? My warm-up routine? Did I do my mobility routine? Yes or no? You have to have these cues in place. Business. Where are my margins at? How often am I checking them? Have I done my monthly review of profitability? Have I done my quarterly review of profitability? Have I had a look at my weekly cash flow projections? You have to have the accountabilities in place, and they have to be recurring and frequent. When it comes to your career, did I hit my KPIs last week? Am I on track to hit my monthly KPIs this month? Yes or no? You have to execute, and you have to put in place regular, frequent accountability cues to pull yourself up when you don't execute. Because there are going to be times, guys, we're all going to do it. No one's perfect. There are going to be times where you fail to execute the basics perfectly and consistently. And you need to have a mechanism in place to pull yourself up and call yourself out in your own bullshit. Because if you don't, you can't recalibrate. And then you're going to find yourself in all sorts of shit in whatever area of your life you're trying to progress. Step 4, the final step. Resist the temptation to pursue the fancy without first building and maintaining the fundamentals. I'm going to say that to you guys again. Resist the temptation to pursue the fancy without first building and maintaining the fundamentals. This is the trap that you're going to fall into. It's the trap of focusing on decorating the Christmas tree when the actual tree underneath is a piece of shit. And it's so easy to fall into this temptation, guys, because we're hardwired to look for the fancy shit. We're hardwired to look for the new shit. Not only are we hardwired, society is in a point right now where our attention is drawn to the new. Our attention is drawn to the fancy. I cannot stress this enough. Resist the temptation to pursue the fancy without first building and maintaining the strongest fucking foundation you can build and maintain. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Fitness Times Business Podcast. Be sure to subscribe, and if you enjoyed listening to this episode, make sure you give us a 5-star rating. Until next time, we'll catch you on the flip side.